Okay, I think we can start. Welcome to this last panel of PRIO's European Security Week. My name is Bruno Oliveira Martins. I'm a senior researcher here at PRIO. I'm also editor-in-chief of Security Dialogue. And this panel that we have today is part of a discussion that we want to bring to this set of events that we've been holding throughout the week, which is a possibility of widening the contours of the discussion about the current international security situation. Of course, critical security studies has been about widening the agenda of what security is and what can be understood by. And so our idea of having this discussion today is precisely to bring scholars that somehow have been engaged in many of these discussions throughout the years, and that are, that have either published with a journal or that are part of the editorial team. And because I think that this will bring a different flavor to the discussions that we've been having, and it's also representative of what security research at PRIO is. So the title of the event today is International Security and the Contribution of Critical Approaches to Security and Technology. So we will have as speakers today Marala Kaufmann at the Department of Criminology and Sociology of Law at the University of Oslo. We have Maria Gabrielsen-Jumbert, who is a senior researcher at PRIO and also a deputy editor with Security Dialogue. Then we have Lili Müller at the Department of Media and Communication at the University of Oslo. Welcome back. And Christopher Liden, who is also senior researcher at PRIO and also deputy editor of Security Dialogue. We were also planning on having Andreas Hirblinger from NUPI, but he woke up sick this morning, and so unfortunately he cannot join us today. So a very few practical information. So the fire exits are that way and that way. The event is being live streamed and recorded, and so it will be made available online afterwards as well. So we'll be having kind of informal discussion. There is no PowerPoint presentation, etc. I'll be asking a few questions to the speakers, and then we'll just take it from there. So the first round of questions that I would like to bring to the table has to do with what are the critical questions we should be asking these days. Because if we look at the international security situation, we hear a lot about rearmament, competition, geostrategy, armaments, etc. We see very conventional wars mushrooming around the world. There was a period where even though conflict has always existed, the contours of the debates were slightly different, particularly here in Europe. And so what I would like to start asking to our speakers today is what does it mean to think critically about security these days, and what are the questions that perhaps we should be asking these days so that the international debate can be a little bit different. Marala, can we start with you?
Good morning. So I'm guessing that one of the things that really shapes the situation today is the role of technologies, and that's one of my main foci. So technology and security governance, and we can say that basically big data, AI, robotics, identification technology, everything, prediction tools, and so on are key to almost every aspect of security politics today. We can think about situational awareness, precision strikes, counterterrorism, cybersecurity, decision-making, policing, courtrooms. All of that is being changed by technology. So I have mainly studied how technologies do change emergency management. I can expand on that a little bit later. and also policing. In particular, like lately, I've been looking at identification tools in war and disaster situations. And here I mainly focus on data practices. And what do I mean by that? I mean that we should be looking closely at what type of data is actually being collected, how are algorithms for all of these different technologies trained, what is happening there. And I think that it's important, or if you now ask what type of questions should we be asking, a question that I would always ask is like, what are the assumptions and the norms and the values that actually sit in the computed knowledges that is steering so much today? And we can see the closer we look at these things, the closer you sit together with people that actually develop these things, the more you do understand, okay, so you need to make all these categorizations, you need to make profiles, you need to make all sorts of things, for example, for identification technologies that are forms of typifications that we need to ask ourselves whether we, for example, want them in society. So for me, the question is indeed, what is the values that are embedded in these technologies? And we just take them at face value. We think they're kind of neutral elements of both warfare and security politics, but they actually actively shape it. And that's what I'm really interested in, especially when we now think of also associative and predictive logics, where everything is basically associated with everything else, and we try to predict what's going to happen next, and all of that is also actively steering security politics. Now, one question related to that too is like, what does it mean for us as a society when we rely so heavily on flat knowledge? I would call it flat knowledge. It's stuff that is computable, that's mathematic, it's kind of put into machines, put out of machines. What does it mean that we actually are no longer really exposed to lived experience, to bodies, embodiment? All these things are kind of getting lost the more we kind of venture into the big data craze. When it comes to critique, and this is kind of before I hand the microphone over to my colleague, I think I have taken over years now distance from critique as a form of picking apart, as a form of finger pointing and saying, you're doing it all wrong. I think every now and then we're still allowed to say that. But I think a lot more constructive form of criticism is to actually sit together, understand what is going on, to try to understand an alternative way of shaping the future. And you cannot do that alone. You need to bring those big players and the small players on board. So I think that is a way in which we should be, understanding critique. And I'm going back to this wonderful journal. It was the 50th anniversary journal where my colleague Rocco Bellanova and Jonathan Austin, we together said, well, critique is a form of companionship. It's something that actually requires that we sit together and think together and don't just, finger point and pick apart.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. And a very nice bridge over to some of the notes I had taken here. So thank you so much, Mariella. I think that to me, thinking critically today is to always try to go in a way one step further, but it is also very much in line with what you just said. So what I was thinking of when pondering on this question is that for us as a community of critical scholars with different approaches, it's something about always trying to ask further questions, to not simply content ourselves with a critical concept or framework of analysis on some of the events around us, and sort of that's the proof that this is the instance of this violation, for instance, but to try and go a bit further, to try and understand further. So it's to maybe to take one step back as well, to see the bigger picture, and to always to try and understand the developments around us, not just through some of these blanket expression or blanket concepts that are critical, such as to describe several developments again around us. You were pointing to a changing security landscape around us, rearmament in Europe and elsewhere, deep violations of IHL in a number of conflicts we are seeing around us. And it is so easy for us as a public and for us as researchers to also, of course, want to condemn and in a way, and to then maybe to think that by condemning, then that job is done, that critical take has been done. But I think that for us as critical researchers, we should go even further to try and not simply content ourselves with these critical concepts, but to try and go behind and try to understand, not to explain, to justify, but try to understand the bigger picture. And that comes back a little bit to what you are saying, also in terms of companionship, and which is a great term, by the way, and to rather try and understand different actors, and in a way push for an even finer grained analysis of the events we're seeing around us than simply some of these blanket, more critical terms. I just came from another event this morning on the Norwegian humanitarian strategy with all the key actors in the humanitarian field, from the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, the president of the International Federation of the Red Cross, and all, of course, in their roles condemning the deep violations of humanitarian law that we see around us. And I think that our roles as critical scholars is to try and always, in a way, you ask what are the questions we should be asking ourselves. I think that's precisely, in a way, one of the key answers, is that we should always try to ask further questions. So when we see sort of patterns are repeating, we are describing them as scholars, we are analyzing them as scholars, and we should always try to in a way go one step further than what we see are becoming the accepted, in a way, explanations around us. And you talked about flat knowledge, which I also noted here as a keyword to pick up on. And I think that our roles also in a polarized society that we are in today is also to try and, speaking of fine-grained analysis, to bring in nuance, to bring in concepts that can describe things with more fine-grained nuances. And when you say flat knowledge, of course, you think about AI very quickly, or at least that's what comes to mind here in terms of the reproduced texts or narratives or pictures even, that will be sort of the reproducing the same vocabulary, language, ways of describing things. And how can we as researchers resist that and again, in a way, use our language and our vocabulary to describe things in even more fine-grained ways. And in that, I'll use also, sort of speaking of, we're also discussing a lot the use of AI in our research or for writing as a helping tool for writing and so forth. And I've been thinking quite a lot about that lately in terms of when you struggle with the text and writing. And I think as critical scholars, and for probably all scholars, writing and using writing as a tool, there's something about writing can be hard, but that's part of the thinking process, and that's maybe part of the tool for us as critical scholars as well. We write, we rewrite, we reformulate, and in that process we are coming to that more fine-grained level of analysis, and that cannot be helped by other tools. That's our pen or our laptop and our thought that can be helped forward in that thinking process. Yes.
Yeah, thanks so much. Is the understanding the friction as being productive, and the part of the process. It's not something that we can just eliminate. Can I ask you the same question, Lily?
Now? Okay, great. Thanks. Thank you so much, and for two great comments already, which is very hard to follow. But I want to pick up on your point on like nuances and like friction and the opposition of flattening knowledge. I think is so important in today's society. I'm a tiny bit younger than the rest of the people on this panel, so I've read all of their work in my studies, and it's been in the generation of scholars I'm in, there's a whole question like, what's the even point of being critical anymore? Have we like taken everything apart? And kind of what Mareile said, about like she's taken a little break from the whole critical security. But now I won't say more than ever, but it's still extremely important to be critical and to keep asking those questions and to really get at the frictions and get at the knots. And for me, that's really the important thing when it comes to being critical, like staying with the core of those critical questions. Just because we've like before unpacked like what makes a threat or who defines what a risk is and the imagination of what security is itself, those questions don't disappear. It's almost with the way the world has become now. I'm not saying that the problems we're seeing in European securities, that's like kind of the topic of this week, they're not new. They've maybe been more further away from Europe and they're coming into Europe. So we have to maybe face them more head on. But those questions of friction are something we still have to keep asking to really get at what's going on in the world. And then to what I ask in the questions in my study, I also more look at technology. So very similar look at like who is defining the narratives, which are the bigger critical questions, like who's defining what security is and who's defining what threat is. But these questions now become also important in the tinier bits of like building LLMs or building the technology and who are these companies. And I'm sure we'll get to that in the like later on the panel as well. But you know, what are the ideologies of the companies that are building this technology that we're all so rapidly taking up as a society? And how is that happening? You know, this report came out this week from Microsoft that Norway is the third biggest user of AI in the world or something like that, you know, and also the support of the government that we should be doing that. So there's a lot of critical questions to be asked of their view of democracy and our views as a country versus what is embedded in those technologies. I think as critical scholars, we can really ask those also tinier questions of like, what values are built into this technology, what world view is being flattened out when we use that technology, and what frictions disappear in the practice of using this. Yeah, that's my short answer.
Thank you. So, fully in line with what you all covered so far. The traditional understanding of critical theory has to do with questioning both the descriptive assumptions about the world that are kind of commonplace, commonsensical, but also the normative or the value basis of those conceptions. So making things that are taken for granted visible and placing them under scrutiny. And that's very much reflected in the field of critical security studies and also a sort of trademark of the journal Security Dialogue that we're currently very much involved in. And one could say that at the moment where so much attention has been turned towards how do we create, how do we maintain security, there's no time for asking these critical questions. This is not a time to start to ask, oh, but what do you mean with national security when you fear that national security is really threatened? What is it that you mean with that talking about security introduces a sort of state of exception that allow you to do very effective things as a politician? An extremely efficient way of politicizing an issue is to talk about it as a security issue. Well, that's exactly why we talk about security these days. So who needs to point that out? And we don't have time for that. What we need to do at the moment, you could say, is really just to mobilize the whole of society for creating security, the security that we need. And that's to a large extent what we see happening at the moment, and it's reflected in the academic study of security in Norway and internationally. Lots of funding, lots of attention goes towards that exercise, creating knowledge that can allow us to maintain security. But the project of critical security studies has all along been to ask, okay, so but what does that mean? And what does that do to security, to society. So when you mobilize all of society for security, it does transform society in ways that are not really comprehended or taken into account by that security discourse. So it's, in a sense, even more fundamental than maintaining the kind of certain existential threats to society, that you also maintain the society you want while addressing those threats. So this also speaks to how these two movements are complementary and should not be juxtaposed as an either or. And obviously my hunch would be that this is the moment that we need that critical awareness the most. But we also need the conversation, as you alluded to, between those approaches, between those movements. So it's sort of a guarantee against groupthink, and that's also very important for security. We also heard about that with the example of kind of the circles around Putin in the previous session, how groupthink leads to bad decisions, and challenging those are very much in the interest of security. So there's this dialogue that you can have between different conceptions of security, which is not just potentially disruptive to certain security agendas, but also counters certain counterproductive ideas of security that tend to sneak into a security agenda. And I think we see those today, for instance, in the discussions on, we will return to that, but in discussions on rearmament and security politics that may have adverse effects, and the awareness of that, the pointing out those critiques are important. But also, now critical security studies is like, it's at least, it has been quite important as a direction of security studies for 30 years. And there are certain conceptions in critical security studies that also need to be subjected to critique. And that's also what you started to do with questioning critique. The way that we in critical security studies mobilize the concept of security in order to criticize is also somehow reinforcing conceptions of the exceptional nature of security that we also want to challenge. So a bit like when Marxism grew older and the concepts of capitalism, for instance, turned into a more frozen grand narrative that explained everything without people really necessarily talking about exactly the same thing. So it just mobilized the criticism without the direct connection to the stuff that you were criticizing. The same danger I see now with the critical conception of security. So there is a need for sometimes just talking about the things we're criticizing without just using the concept of security as a placeholder. One person who did this at least 20 years ago and who did point out certain directions or sentiments in the current thinking on security was our colleague Peter Burgess, who took over the journal Security Dialogue and edited it in a certain kind of direction of very clearly kind of a critical security studies agenda. And this morning I took up his book called The Ethical Subject of Security, and looked at the first page where he describes in the introduction security as ethos and episteme. And I'd like to just read the two first paragraphs, if you allow me to, because I think it says a lot about the time we're in and how security, when it becomes evasive but also all-encompassing, is something we need to think very critically about. So he writes, few concepts encapsulate the depth and breadth of human experience like security. This brave concept, noble in its aims and solemn in its aspirations, strives simultaneously to embody what we most cherish and to mobilize the means and modes of thwarting its threatened loss. Both ethos and episteme, it purports to both feel and to know, to identify the things we cherish, to look ahead toward the danger that threatens it, and to mobilize a campaign of stalwart normativity, setting out in the most scientific terms what action should be taken, what must be suffered in order to prevail, and what can be sacrificed in the name of averting the threat. Security reflects our knowledge of the past and our aspirations for the future, draws upon our experience and the experience of others. It reflects what we know while simultaneously authorizing us to delve into the unknown, legitimating action based on certain understanding of future life. It mediates, structures, and regulates forms of uncertainty that we consider increasingly inescapable, unavoidable, or inevitable in our lives. The discourse of security makes uncertainty an incessant certainty. When called upon in the right setting, with the right reserves and humility, with the right measure of consideration for the sublime dangers on our earth, it aspires to touch the very frontier between faith and reason. Security is called to cast itself into the metaphysics of the unknown, into implicit and sometimes awkwardly explicit concerns for the otherworldly. So that's a challenge to think about what are the metaphysics that underlie our very material mobilizations of security at the moment. Thank you.
Well, thanks a lot. I think this was a quite exciting first round of answers that really shows that there is a different possibility of thinking and talking about security these days. And now I would like to go from the kind of the more general level and try to ask in which ways your own work, the work of each of you, can help us making sense of today's socio-political problems. So kind of this is the general question. And in your case, Maraila, so of course you've worked on many different things throughout your career. You had your very impactful work on resilience, and then kind of what it means to do critique, and then more recently you have work on the use of facial recognition for the identification of dead bodies and what that does to death and to dying, etc. So kind of in which ways can your and the project, your ERC project that you've been working on, in which way does your project stimulate new ways of thinking about bodies and death, and could there be any implications for dealing with repair after atrocities, for example?
Yeah, thank you so much. Actually, my other project is more about genetics. So this is actually a project from the Norwegian Research Council, and I'm very, very thankful for having received that money, because I was also it allowed me to delve into both questions of technology, and then I will also end up on something that is more like hyper-local traditions. So the whole point of the project was to really look at both sides here. So when it comes to facial recognition for the identification of dead bodies, there was a lot to learn, especially since the rise of the Ukraine conflict. Jessica Okta, who's also part of the Security Dialogue universe, she's been writing that we should consider dead bodies as subjects that prompt us to think about their role in security politics. And actually, the United Nations do ask us, or even, it's a duty to search for an identity and recover the dead from battlefield arenas, for example. So they have a right to be found and buried. And that's clear because not only are families very much concerned with this, but it's also politics, right? So who's lost how many bodies? But at the same time, I think something that I came to cherish throughout this project was also to understand it's a deeply cosmological question too for many cultures to understand where their loved ones are buried. Now, what I was interested in with this project was not just that bodies need to be secured, but also how they're secured, because that's exactly this question of subjectification. So what do I do with a body? What happens to a body when I secure it? And now we have seen a rise of identification technologies, and here in specific facial recognition technologies. We know them all from all sorts of areas of our lives. Even our phones are now open with facial recognition technologies. Now, so what has happened here is that big companies such as Clearview have been venturing into that idea from identifying live bodies to dead bodies. And is there a difference? Yes. I would say there's definitely a difference. Not only do the several companies that I've been speaking to think about identification still here as like maximum precision, cutting-edge technologies, because we always want to kind of push things further. It's very much like a commercial narrative there, right? And also, very unfittingly, one of them called it a killer app. So I was like, be careful what you say here, because actually later on it so turned out that their facial recognition technology on dead bodies was turned into probably something that can be used for automated weapons. Now, I think we need to, or what I needed to do is to understand, okay, what's really going on here? How do these people create these technologies? And what happens to dead bodies here? First and foremost, actually, a lot of data that goes into the feeding of those algorithms is data from marginalized populations. So I'm just picking one. Usually we would speak about race now, but I'm picking arrestees. I'm picking people that have been incarcerated, they had law enforcement contact, they're dead now. So it seems to be just easy to casually get hold of this type of information to train facial recognition algorithms. You need, for example, a picture of a person with closed eyes in order to be able to map what they would be looking like, right? So, and where can we get this? We can get this from RST databases. So in that sense, we already have a super marginalized population, and there's tons of other databases. But here we have a marginalized population that is being used to actually make something of maximum precision, right? But that means also that we not only use data of those that have once lived and are now deceased, we actually are also using, in order to train these algorithms, we're also using data of corpses. So things are being captured, and like faces are being captured. They pride themselves of saying, okay, we can even capture those that are decaying, that are mutilated. So those bodies are also feeding into these algorithms. And what I'm saying here, or what I'm suggesting with my work, is that there is a certain undermining of the original idea, namely to recover bodies in order to bury them and to put them to rest. But what we do now is actually we put them into databases where they continue acting lively, right? They're continuing to be used and reused, and they're being modulated, and like this is what I would call restless data bodies. So where bodies are actual corpses. So we're having these databases of deceased people that continue actually producing work, almost, also for companies here in specific. So I would call this again posthumous biovalue. They're producing value. They're doing work in these liminal spaces. So they conduct labor. Now, what we need to ask ourselves then is, what does it mean when these things happen to put a body to rest, both the corpse, but also the digital body. Now, if you allow me, I would also like to go the other direction. So you asked what are new ways of thinking about bodies and death and repair after atrocities. And now with our focus on technologies, and clearly I'm not the only one, it's everywhere. We're all studying the focus of technology. I felt like it's important that we also look at very hyper-local cultures and how they also deal with the identification of death. So that was, or of dead bodies. And that was very important for me. Also to not lose track of the fact that there is a lot going on in religion, in cosmology, in traditions, and so on, that really do try to understand where's that body, how can I find that body, how can I identify my loved ones. Now, here I've been embracing a project together with my wonderful postdoc colleague, who is herself South African. So she really brought me on board into the post-apartheid regime South Africa, and was asking me to, we were brave, I think, by saying, okay, we know of the culture of sangomas there. These are seers. They are kind of local, like they're traditional healers, if you so want to. And we've come across instances where they have been contributing together with forensics to the identification of dead people because they had visions. They would take people to mass graves and so on. Now, one can ask me questions. The first questions I always get is, and does it work? Did they have visions where they kind of find the buried? Of course, that's not the point. The point is here to understand how they do contribute to repair after atrocity as well. And sometimes they do that, for example, in dialogue with forensics. We worked with a fantastic forensics specialist who she would like work in Zimbabwe and looked for genocide victims, and she would work together, with local chiefs who would know, for example, who would have memories, who would see plants that only would come and grow in places where dead bodies are buried, because it's that simple. We would think this is a biological instance. To them, it is actual. It's a sign. So this is how they do find bodies together with local. With local, hyper-local traditional representatives. And so, but what I also found really interesting, and that's where I close, is, and I pointed at that earlier, with all this flat technological mathematic knowledge, we kind of lose track of what it means to have a body and have a lived experience. And this is something that I found fascinating, how we actually did interview some of those sangomas. I wouldn't, because that would be extractivism, but we had someone who actually set out, a South African team who set out and find them. And they said, well, we need to consider, for example, South African culture as something where visions are a social fact. We cannot ignore that. And to them, it was a very clearly embodied and embedded practice to just say, one Sangoma described, I had itchy feet. I dreamt this. I needed to go and I needed to walk until I would find, those who are deceased. And I think I'm not trying to kind of, exoticize this and say, oh, isn't that exciting? The point is rather to remember these people with their commitments, with their close links to community, actually are doing something for dead body identification, and potentially they're sometimes doing more for repair after atrocity than maybe one or the other big truth commission that is being set in place after atrocities. Oh no.
Well, this is really fascinating. It really shows that how particular forms of knowledge can really help us think differently about some dynamics. I think that this issue of of these restless data bodies, it actually sits, and we can talk more about that afterwards, but with this idea in some cultures where death is just a passage into something else. It's not the end in itself. And you have in some cultures that people that are physically dead, they are more alive and more present than some people that are physically alive. So it's really interesting. We can talk more about that. But I will pass on to Maria. I think that your work also has, a lot to bring to the discussions that we're having today. Many years of working on humanitarian borders, at intersection between humanitarianism, borders, and technology. More recently, you've started to work into the role of images and how AI brings new elements to assess this. So I would like to hear from you, how is this playing up in the humanitarian sector? So the ones that are, the humanitarian actors, but also the ones that are producing images, how is this changing the humanitarian field?
Thank you, Bruno. And I'll start by making a small, in a way, connection to what the Marielle's fascinating research that you just shared with us, to sort of contextualize where my sort of initial interest also in these images comes into this, how the role of technologies, how the role of securitized spaces is a context where images have a particular role. So I've always been interested in how various humanitarian crises are narrated, presented, mobilized around, and in that, of course, the images that we see, whether that's in on the evening news or in our everyday social media feeds or elsewhere, of course, are key or play a crucial role in shaping those understandings and what grasps us, or where is the attention just to the attention span, in a way, just to scroll on. My initial interest in some of the first cases of the use of AI images in humanitarian contexts was precisely in highly securitized contexts of the European borders and the Australian detention centers. So, to contextualize a little bit, the various humanitarian actors or advocacy organizations providing assistance to refugees and their displaced populations are, of course, are concerned with those they are there to help. All the while, they also want to communicate about their actions and the importance of keeping attention to, for instance, the situation of refugees in Greece. And in a context of, for instance, facial recognition and images being shared online, being potentially spread across different spaces or being picked up by different actors, it's no longer, in a way, a straightforward act to publish images of refugees, for instance, in a refugee camp in Greece. So all these actors operating in Greece to support refugees have also come to develop very stringent guidelines and rules for how for what kind of images they can publish online, to illustrate their daily activities and to keep up their advocacy and communication work. And in that communication, their visuals is often very anonymous. You can see groups seen from afar or seen from behind and so forth. And one of the first instances I came across there was this small grassroots organization who used an AI image of a young 5-year-old or of a young refugee girl. The prompt had said something like a 5-6-year-old refugee girl can you create an image of a 5-6-year-old refugee girl in a refugee camp in Greece? And then you could, what the image that was produced was a close-up. You can see clearly the gaze of this young girl, and that organization used this image of a close-up image, an artificial image, in their communication, saying that in order to protect the real refugees, we are using an AI-generated image, which to me sort of illustrates a lot. It also illustrates precisely this landscape where images published for different reasons can be picked up and become a security concern, very concretely for people forcibly displaced. But at the same time, the generation of this artificial image was being presented as there to protect the real refugees. Of course, you can imagine it raised so many questions that I just had to pursue this this instance. So I've been interested over the past few years in, is this going to be more widespread? At that time when that image was published, late 2023, and in the early 2024, there's been sort of this saying, yes, this is a first instance of AI image used by humanitarian organizations. We're likely to see many more of these. Then in 24, several other instances, often very sort of transparently, this is AI produced, and you can understand that the reason why they use this is because there are a lot of other privacy and ethical concerns with using other real photography-based images. But we also rather quickly, also saw the backlash against the use of such images, that they were widely criticized. So one of the first instances was this Amnesty International report earlier in 2023, where they to illustrate the police violence in Colombia and the violence in a way on protesters. They were using AI images in order to, in a way, protect the identity of the real protesters. And that received a massive backlash, like that Amnesty International, such a well-respected actor, would use artificial images. So I think that also a lot of that backlash, I also said, since you asked me, like, how are humanitarian actors now picking up on that technology? I think that also set really a standard in terms of other actors in this field being really mindful today of the trust that they are endowed with, and that if they were to experiment and try this out, that could really impact their trust that they are so dependent on. But I'm coming now, so in a way, where does that bring us today? What I see now, interestingly, although there are some of these interesting examples also of the use of AI images where there are no visuals, such as from the detention camps in Australia, there are almost no actual photography from those contexts. So some other lawyers try to actually produce visuals based on the numbers of testimonies from former detainees in those camps. So that technology then allowed to create an actual visual, which is also an interesting example. Because we know how important the visuals are for grasping our attention. But what I think is interesting today is that we have this conjunction today of two sort of developments. On the one hand, the humanitarian sector has come to almost brand AI-generated images as poverty porn 2.0. So they're using this very, very negative term for AI-generated images that are just reproducing the same cliches that we've seen for decades. So on the one hand, they're branding them as, no, we will never do that. We will never experiment with that kind of technology. We are authentic. We're only using like the authentic photography from the field. And at the same time, we have a context now where the audiences, all of us, we don't trust anymore what we see. When we see real photography from atrocities that we also read about and hear about, we almost no longer believe what we are seeing. It's so easy to say it's probably AI generated. You can, of course, imagine that for a range of the different violations we've seen over the past few years. It's very frequent in Gaza, for instance, to simply say, or it's a lot of the pictures that have come out have been pushed back as it's probably created, it's probably generated. More recently, there was an example from an animal welfare campaign in the UK, putting out pictures of the horrific conditions in which the animals were held there, but the audience simply pushed it back, saying, no, that must be AI generated because it looked so awful. So we're in a context where maybe some actors in that field are really taking a distance from using the technology, but as an audience, we're in a way left with what are our tools to know what we can trust and not.
That's super interesting. It also, we can go back in time and also ask, whether photographs were themselves neutral. There's a lot of politics in art and stuff like that, but of course the challenges are different today. Lily, you have your work has been focusing on issues of cybersecurity, very much influenced by STS perspective, science and technology studies, which is, not coincidentally a fact that you've also spent time at Cornell in the US at a very well-known department of STS. More recently, your work has interrogated whether we are seeing a convergence in the way that key actors think and imagine cybersecurity and artificial intelligence. You have a forthcoming article with Security Dialogue precisely on these problematics. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you see these things happening?
Sure. No, that paper that's coming out hopefully soon, so everyone go read it, was very fun. And it's funny you mentioned Cornell, because I've obviously been doing research on the politics of cybersecurity for a long time. And I went to Cornell, which is like upstate New York, and like nothing happens there except you have academic time to think. And I came back to London. And before I went, when I was doing my PhD research, if you said the word AI in the context of cybersecurity, everyone kind of knew that you didn't know what you're talking about. Like, you talked about machine learning. If you really knew what you're talking about, AI was like a sales pitch. And I came back 2 years later and AI was everywhere. Like, it was like I'd gone to a different planet and came back to the society we now live in, right? Every poster in the hallway had AI something. I don't know, it was so mind-boggling coming from how quickly that went. So that's how I decided to do this research on like the convergence of AI cybersecurity, because 2 years ago that was like the sign that would never happen, and now every cybersecurity company was talking about AI. So I started researching how they became one and what that actually meant, and the imaginaries of security in that, and how something that was so clearly defined as separate suddenly became one. And a lot of that research showed that we interviewed all these people in the UK government, NGOs, and Secret Service, and it was so interesting to see, like, actually bringing in critical security studies, like fundamental questions of who imagines what security is, the Silicon Valley companies that these governments were using. If they go to them and ask, like, is this technology secure, they would say, like, oh yeah, don't worry, we've made sure it doesn't swear. But for a government, the concept of security is something very different. So you could start tracing, which we do in this paper, like the different understandings of what security means in this convergence of AI and cybersecurity. So that became a very interesting research to bring in these classical questions of who defines what, and what is changing in something as fundamental as a state security strategy when AI is implemented, and what kind of hurdles are being jumped over to get to the point where we use AI. And what is forgotten or what's flattened when that's included. So there's definitely a convergence, but then that's like a UK case, obviously. So if you go back to like Europe, every country is very different from what I've seen so far in the convergence of AI and cybersecurity. So I haven't researched every country, I've just done one. But yeah, I don't think there's like a general convergence, but I think it's interesting to see, and that comes back to like all of our research. I think, like, where does AI get placed in our field, and what impact does it have in changing the field? So yeah, that's a very short answer.
No, I think this is a great example of the enduring and persistent importance of the critical questions, that really shed new lights on issues that are otherwise covered in a particular way. And I think that the article did exactly that. So yeah, very, very well done. Christopher, to you, you've been working on issues of the ethics of technology, well, the ethics of many things, but the ethics of technology in the humanitarian and border context, among others, but also the ethics of peace building. You have, recent work on societal preparedness, societal security, national risk assessments, and these are issues that are becoming increasingly relevant. I would say, particularly in the Nordic context, where the debates about societal security are really part of the conversation about what it means to prepare and to feel secure. And so I'd like to ask you, what are the key ethical questions in the field of preparedness? And we are entering a phase where societal security, total defense, national preparedness programs are gaining a central stage. And what are the questions that we should be asking that we are not asking enough?
Thank you so much. So I'd first like to start with really pointing out how relevant and interesting your interventions are for the very fundamental question of security that I kind of read about in Peter's book, while not operate on that very kind of abstract theoretical level, but talking about very specifics. But and that's been sort of the methods partly developed within security dialogue of looking into critical theory through very concrete, usually material examples, and combining this critical theoretical reflection with that. So the empirics, the concreteness, where you find like unexpected, unrecognized aspects of our perceived kind of phenomena, how they challenge our theoretical assumptions. And I think you pointed very well to that in your work. And also it made me think of the way in which AI is now gaining kind of momentum as a metaphysical concept to the same extent as security. Saying AI mobilizes something. So in this meeting place between AI and security, you have something very interesting going on, obviously, at the moment. In my research, I've been looking with Peter Burgess previously. I won't start to read again from his book, but I could have, because my work on the ethical foundations of policies of preparedness really comes out of previous analysis on the implicit values that are built into European security politics, and in particular politics of technology and how technology is going to save us. So that's been a long-standing research program, and we also had a Nordic Center of Excellence on security technology and societal values, where we focused on how this plays out, in particular also in the Nordic setting, and we did this together, some of us. And in that project, one of the things I did was to look into national risk assessments in the Nordic region, and then talking to the people who produce them and trying to understand how do they end up with this set of the largest threats or risks that the nation is facing. How did that conceptualize certain national values implicitly? And what was the concrete process for ending up with that? And it turns out that process is very different in all the Nordic countries. It's actually different in all European countries. And instead of reflecting a certain kind of philosophy of security or of risk or of values in each of those countries, it just comes out of their institutions. It comes out of the established practices of how do you produce a report, what are the agencies responsible for that, and what is the knowledge in that seems relevant, what is the knowledge at hand. So, for instance, in Finland, they place a lot of emphasis on their national risk assessments as a basis for their national security strategy. And this seems to be a very kind of scientific, systematic way to not just base kind of national security policy on the kind of what gains the most attention of the day, but they go through very systematically all the different kinds of risks to society, from environmental risks, things that have to do with natural hazards, through societal risks, and then they do also include military threats in that. So it looks very scientific, and it really legitimizes the national security policy. But if you look back to that, the national risk assessment comes out of previous national security strategies, and it's produced by the very environments that are there to protect the nation. So it is an important source of communication, of awareness, but it is not like a political or scientific corrective as much as it is presenting us with the knowledge that is already premising national security practices in Finland. In Norway, we have not been able to come up with one national risk assessment. There used to be 4. Now there are. Now this is moving. There were attempts at making the agencies responsible for national risk assessments, agreeing on producing one, but they could not agree because they do represent different approaches to security. They represent different institutional agendas and mandates and so on, and it's reflected in what they define as the objective risks to the nation, how they conceptualize those. So I think this is also a lesson in terms of how we think about security policies in general. One could think that the current return to a focus on national security is a reflection of a general move to nationalism, to kind of less democratic approaches to politics, and to militarism, because those are sort of traditional hallmarks of the field of national security. But my sense is that it's rather our fundamental institutions in society that respond to a different political environment. So it comes out of something else than a political ideology or a shift of thinking in those terms. But it does also require a critical awareness of this shift and taking a critical look at, is this way that those institutions respond to the changing environment actually what we want? Because as a society and as a democracy, we should always critically question the institutions that form or order our political system. So in a new project, we look into the ways that priorities in national policies of preparedness are justified across different areas. It's a project led here from PRIO, but with lots of different actors that are involved in this field. And what we do is to challenge or ask, how do you justify the obvious case these days is spending a lot of funds on defense while less on issues related to climate change or pandemics. This is the typical juxtaposition. But what we will do is to go beyond that by looking much more closely into what is the thinking in these various fields. How do they justify these priorities when they meet in the same room and are asked to share their ideas on this? But also, how does that sit with how priorities are actually made in practice in these fields, which is certainly different from the kind of official stories or how they would generally justify what is done. So that also speaks to this tension between ideas and institutions, practices, and the material conditions for politics, which is kind of where a security dialogue article would typically start. Thank you.
Okay, I think this was really interesting to hear, how going from the abstract discussions, or at least a very potentially abstract question in the beginning, how things kind of materialize in different ways, in a very concrete way. So my last question now, it's again in line with this logic of, staying with the trouble, staying with the friction, not turning you're back on friction because friction is productive. And so I thought about asking you two very difficult questions, and then I'm asking if you can please answer very briefly to make it even more difficult. So I think that when you look at today's international security situation, our societies, etc., tell us one thing that brings you worry and one thing that brings you hope. So I think that I didn't want to stay just with the hope. I also didn't want to stay just with the worry. I think that those two things, they need to go hand in hand. Let's maybe go in reverse order now. Can I start with you, Christopher?
Okay, thanks. So my immediate kind of the major worry on the horizon that we all share is a third world war. It's nuclear war. It's the types of risks that outweigh anything else we can think of in terms of security risks. But I'm at the same time worried about how that worry removes attention from all the security issues that are both currently very, very present, and those that are further ahead in the horizon. So, in critical security studies, it's common to kind of ask, okay, security for whom and what? And in the national context of national security, we then typically focus on the nation instead of a global focus, but also on the immediates instead of a long-term perspective, and on humans instead of other species, as in the example you mentioned. My hope is that this kind of moment of shrinking the focus on security and peace will provoke a counter-reaction. And I do suspect that this reaction will necessarily force itself through because of all the attention that comes into this very narrow conception of peace and security. So I'm hopeful that it creates a counter-reaction.
Thank you. Thank you for the difficult question. I also went with my gut answer to your question, and that's the tremendous increase of the power of these private companies to have developed the technology that so many countries around the world are relying on, but also the rise of fascism globally in Europe, but also within these companies, and what we see that these companies produce in their manifestos and how ingrained they are in fascism. And the combination of that really, really worries me. So I think, and alongside of that, it worries me that our collective inability to see that as citizens and as states when it's right there in front of us, and these companies publish it, and we still, I don't know, 90% of the Norwegian population, I'm making up a number, but a lot are using ChatGPT every day. But while knowing the connections it has to the political undertones that these companies has, so that really worries me, and where that is both going for democracy, us as people, the brain rot that we're seeing in students and the younger generations. And when it comes to hope, I found that even more, maybe a more difficult question. But I feel like we're beyond the question of hope. And I even think that, I know there's a lot of literature on this in critical security studies. I'm not the only one to say that. But I think this whole question of hope that it can solve things, that the hope with AI can make things better, that we're very beyond that. And I think even more the word hope is not dangerous, but we need to maybe let that go for a bit and look more, coming back to what it means to be critical and ask critical questions. That's where the hope is for me, to keep doing that and actually open up what's really happening instead of relying on a hope of something that might not be realistic anymore. So I'm glad I'm not the last speaker.
Thank you. But very well put, both of you, to these two difficult questions, and part of my answer is already relating to several parts of your answers. Since I'm currently living in France, I'll use the very nice formulation that one of my colleagues there, an old professor, and probably from that 68th generation, said when I was asking a little bit about how he thought things were going these days in the university, in academia, and elsewhere, and. He said, "Well, now we're approaching next year's elections in France, which is, of course, one thing that brings us a worry in terms of a rise of more nationalist and anti-democratic forces in France. So that is a worry, specifically in that context, but also more broadly elsewhere in Europe, and what that will do to our possibility to have these or to have critical discussions." But he said, "Well, now we're going into," he said in a sort of a blasé way, that, "Well, now we're going into this period of approaching the elections. At least that will provoke some reactions. That will, a little bit like you were saying, at least we'll see people waking up a little bit again then." So that's maybe part of what brings me worry, is precisely the rise of these forces, more anti-democratic forces, also using the security threats and landscape as justifications for their policies, and as justifications for putting down our possibilities to have nuanced critical discussions. But at the same time, as we see the rise of these forces, we also see the rise of counter reactions, as you were saying as well. And despite the fact that when we follow international news now, it is easy to almost only see the brute force and the militarization and rearmament, but a lot of those forces are not succeeding in what they're trying to achieve either. And what we also see are counter reactions, and we see, in addition to our contributions or attempts at contributing as critical scholars, we also see protests and public opinion reacting. And that brings hope, I think, and that very much, we hope that will continue to see those counter reactions and brave attempts at simply resisting those attempts at putting down the spaces for democratic discussions. And it brings hope to have good discussions like these ones, and to continue to be able to continue to ask what are the other questions we should be asking.
Thank you. I think I speak in extension of all of you guys. And if you would ask me what worries me, we would sit here tomorrow, I guess. But what I want to pick out on is this, I'm not sure if it's increasing. I'm not sure if it's always been there, but this disconnect between, high level politics, technologization and so on, and the reality on the ground, if you so want to very simply put, like that often the political sphere is so removed of all of the stuff that happens. Yeah, of course we see the emotionalized pictures and all these things, but we have the difficulty of really bringing back the crowd on the ground is really difficult. So but I'd rather want to actually focus on what gives me hope. And you mentioned staying with the trouble comes from Donna Haraway, wonderful woman. She also coined the term of becoming with, which I think is really important, because she's someone who sees the connections between most things on this planet. So we're not in this alone, right? So she sees how we all influence each other. And she also observes, like, we're gonna have to become with each other. There's no way in which we can just say, let's make a bubble and disappear. We have to relate to what's going on, and we will have to live with big tech, for example, which is one of those forces that really creates the disconnect that I was mentioning on earlier. So I think it's very important that we continue to do exactly as we do, is to ask critical questions, yes. But I think if we want to ask critical questions, it's also really important to get an empirical hold of what that is. I think many of us are doing that. And the interesting thing is, like, if you think becoming with until the very end, you already, when you want to study big tech, you already have to give big tech a reason as to why they should be part of the study. Otherwise, you won't get access. Otherwise, they won't speak to you. So this is actually also an exercise for ourselves to understand and formulate for them, why should you be interested in us working together, not necessarily together with you, but being a critical companion to you and a critical corrective which also means that we need to be ready to learn. But so I think, this question of like why is it important for the big players to be part of our research is really, really important. And doing someone who does data sciences, I like to say, well, if we really study the particularities, for example, of how knowledge is created through data, I would want to suggest, like, once we understood them, how can we make data matter differently? How can we make that matter differently? And then some people come to me and go like, what does it mean? I mean, how can we fight against Clearview and Google and all these big ones? And then it's like, yeah, by opening up, by going there, by knocking on their doors, by taking a close look, by giving input and insight into what is going on, and hopefully being picked up. So on that respect, I mean, I just kind of take a quick, what worries me here is the fact that academia is actually being kind of under attack when it comes to doing exactly that work. And that's why I want to say what gives me hope is people who do this excellent work and who fight back and say we're going to continue doing this because we need that dialogue.
Yeah, I think that's a very good way of jumping into the next section. It also, this idea of becoming with, as applied to technology, also made me think of Paul Virilio's concept of obedient resistance, which means kind of you resist technology, but in order to resist technology, you actually have to use it. You have to you have to be a part of it. You need to understand it so that you can then develop strategies to resist. We have some 15 minutes for listening to your questions. You are also welcome to share something that worries you and something that gives you hope. I think that's a good dichotomy to bring to the table. It's also productive because we saw that it's not necessarily a dichotomy, like it's something that goes in a continuum, or in some cases, a same issue can both be a source of worry and a source of hope. So this can also be circular. So this is interesting. So we are open to questions and comments from the audience.
Adriana from Masaryk University. I'm not sure whether I can frame it as something that worries me and brings me hope, but maybe. And there is something you just said about gathering data and reframing how we use that. And then that brings me back to something that been said, I don't know, an hour ago in the first round, when you talked about how we have to criticize the critical, and whether in this context, big data is really flattening knowledge, or could we use big data as actually the source of something that we potentially would miss even if we are looking through critical lens, trying to identify those groups we have to focus on, we should ask the question, we should bring those people in. But even having critical lens, there are still groups we may miss. And whether the big data isn't the way how to find them, how to basically ask everyone.
So yeah, my impression is that was maybe a question for me. Big data of hope. I mean, there's a lot going on in terms of data feminism, or the way in which we can reuse and recirculate and rethink big data practices. I want to give two examples that kind of, I want to say the first one doesn't really give me hope, but at least it makes a difference. And the second one gives me hope. So the first one is, for example, the different companies I've been interviewing, how they train their algorithms, right? There's already slight differences, at least, in terms of how one can do it. Right? Like, for example, one company says, no, we have very strict use of this type of databases and they're being very well curated. We may not, for example, just here now I'm making up, we may not kind of draw on marginalized, all of them have been drawing on marginalized populations, but still we're using very limited databases, for example, for training, maybe even synthetic data for training. I can discuss whether this is smart or not, but in any case, and also more privacy conservative forms of doing training, I think, whereas on the other hand, we have companies like Clearview who just take whatever is available online and they get their hands on and what they consider public. And they even said stuff like, oh yeah, but when you sign up and you should know that this is public, you have the little sentence, literally they said, that says it's available for this and that. So it's like, it's an entirely different way of approaching machine learning. The way in which you choose and make databases. So I think this is already a difference in a way that can be made when we think about big data. And then one of the things that is returning, also rightly so, when we think about the logics that sit in algorithms and big data, is a racializing logic. We need to categorize. It's what I said earlier, and this is something that probably comes up pretty much at every single in every single thing I read or attend. What gave me hope was this South African team that said, well, how about if we look into algorithms that take decisions in courtrooms and that are racialized decisions in courtrooms? How if we use algorithms again to identify that discrimination, right? So I think there is a way of being able to reprogram technologies, at least to the extent that we can identify easier what's going on in terms of discrimination, and I think that is something that would, at least on that level, give me hope, while there's still enough left to be worried about.
Does anyone want to add something to this? Okay, thanks. I think this was actually a very good question. Like can in some cases big data actually show or reveal something that not even kind of critical questions could ever reveal. At least it's a very stimulating way of thinking. Yeah. Any further questions?
Thank you, Jan, Maastricht University as well. Recently, we've been venturing into generative agents with our research, playing with those, trying to simulate human behavior as frankly as we can. And what I was thinking when you were talking about the synthetic data, and this is perhaps for all of you, what do you perceive as a greatest ethical pitfall when it comes to generative agents, whether be it generative agents, the synthetic ones, or the ones based on real individuals simulating their behavior, so to speak? Yeah, thanks.
I hear ethics and I look at you, yes. Christopher. So I don't know if you want to start and then we...
Please start yourself. You know this better.
Well, not necessarily. No, well, there are different... I think that ethical issues happen at different levels. In that case, I think that one of the levels has to do with, what would be the application of what would be the product of the work of those agents, because then if when we are dealing with issues that have a very clear impact on humans, being it through creating a weapon or causing some kind of harm or leading to some kind of sorting of people in whatever way, that's one type of ethical questions. And then I think that each of these fields would raise specific issues, about what it means to be human, what it means to make a decision, what is a decision, who participates, all of that. So all of these issues are of an ethical nature. I think that kind of at the larger level of abstraction, I think that the discussion is what is happening there. Has the work produced by, or the output produced by those agents, something that is just faster or at a larger scale than what the human would do, or is it something that is different in nature? You know, like because then it's the ethical issues go on that path. So and I'm not talking about a machine replacing a person and a job, etc. It's not that type of questions. It's about what is the nature of the output that is generated. So I think that this would be a potential way to start answering. But I think that it's difficult to kind of to ask at this very general level. So kind of we would have to know what are those agents doing. You know, and then we need that level of granularity to be a little bit more concrete ethics-wise.
Okay, I allow myself to say something. So I'm currently working on the prediction of behavior from genes, and that's a field that I'm surprised is much larger than I thought first, and there I do see several pitfalls. The first thing goes back to something I've said earlier, that is, we're very excited about the fact that we can predict something if we only had the right amount of data, which is always somewhere at the horizon, you know, and there's this promise, this post-human promise, we no longer even need people if we only have the right, right amount of information, we can predict everything we want. You know, that is one pitfall. I think there will never be enough data that captures human life, and we need to be aware of that, and we need to be aware of the fact that there is always, whenever we predict anything, this is always a form of categorizing behavior, because otherwise a machine wouldn't be able to predict. So we need to have a form of taking artificial selections of what we, what type of behavior it is we want to predict. The second one is that we should be aware of the fact that predictive logics such as that are not just generating human behavior, but they generate impact. They generate something, they generate behavior too. They will make people live according to these predictions. And so that, that impact on actual human beings is something that we should not forget. And then the third one that I observe, at least when I studied genetics, is a certain scientific excitement about the idea that, oh, wow, with all these kind of genome-wide association data models that are actually even working on with entire data ecosystems, no longer just with one algorithm and so on, there's this scientific excitement. If we only, had it all the machines, all the data, we can go there. I see why this is exciting, but all of this is people that are statisticians. They're very rarely even in contact with people anymore. So I see that one should be aware of that part too, and we should very, very carefully assess, and we're often too late, we should very carefully assess that every technology we produce can be appropriated by someone who may misuse it. And that is especially if we do understand, like if we want to understand human behavior, and I'm just saying here in my field, it would be crime, right? How easily can it be misused? That, the whole field in genetics celebrated that we can now predict whether someone has aggressive kind of tendencies and so on. Like in which hands are we using this type of tool? So yes, everything we produce is also appropriated.
Thank you. I will be brief because you've already answered really interestingly to this question. But just I think that my main reflection relating to agents, how they're trained, what they can do, what that will do, is because there are these promises that across databases and statistics, they may be able to much faster do very good analysis compared to what other researchers will do. But there I'm back to what I said earlier about the writing process. What happens if that agent produces that analysis and it's written, but no one has time to read it, or it will be summarized by some other agent? But what happens with the knowledge production process if it's if it's just that machine that has produced it, it's no longer, are we just going to read that? And is that our knowledge production? Or, because I think there's something in that analysis process across different methodologies of working statistically or more on the ground, locally, empirically, and so forth. There is something about that process of that knowledge production, how we learn in that process, that is being lost if it's just that machine that is producing that maybe nice-looking report and maybe seeing patterns that are relevant, but it's something about that knowledge production that is lost. Okay, so just have a sort of meta-reflection as we're coming towards the end. Maybe as a reflection on the types of answers you generated through your prompts in this conversation. And I think one thing that your question also brings out is a critical conception of what is the quality of a human answer that you cannot get from a machine. Is there any difference, and what's that difference? So I think we're pushed into that reflection at the moment. Thinking about the answers that we gave. This session is part of the European Security Week, and then people would expect us to talk about, threats to Europe, threats to Norway, and so on. And did we forget about that? We talked about things like policing, DNA in South Africa, humanitarian concerns outside of Europe, AI developments and technology. Sometimes we talked about technology without even mentioning the notion of security. And so was this kind of a false flag operation, or what was the thing? So I think that while we focus a lot these days on national security, there has been a move over the past 30 years in critical security studies towards focusing on a lot of phenomena that we don't think these days about as security, when the focus has returned to European security. But also, so we've focused on cybersecurity, we've focused on humanitarian crisis as a security problem, we've focused on technology, DNA, and so on, as counterterrorism, so something you worked a lot on, as security issues. Now that seems in a way to be something of the past, but it's also something that is mobilized at the moment in the name of societal security, which was like a critical concept. Now it's mobilized for total defense, for European security, in ways that, as I said, look away from security elsewhere and aspects of security that are not national security. And so many people focus on national security these days, so it's not an either or. It's just the point that let's sustain that broader focus when going into European security as a kind of a moment. Thank you.
Yes, I think this is a perfect way to end the seminar, also to put it in the context of the European Security Week, because this is the end of our seminar or our talk today, but it's also the end of PRIO's European Security Week. I would like to thank my colleague Nick Marsh, who has been the kind of the driving force behind this event that was highly successful. Thanks a lot for all of you that came today and came through the week. There are many familiar faces that I've seen since Monday. That is fascinating. Also, thanks a lot to all that followed online. These are very important discussions that we had this week and that we will keep on having in the weeks and in the months ahead. Thank you.